Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the video conference call for the analyst earnings call for TAURON Group for the first 9 months of this year. The host of this meeting will be Mr. Warek Wadowski, the CFO of TAURON Board Management. And for questions and answers, we'll have experts available. Mr. Dariusz Niemiec, the CEO of TAURON Wytwarzanie, TAURON Generation, who is remotely available to us. Mr. Ronald Makieja, the Executive Director for Controlling Affairs, and Mr. Witold Lebek, the Manager of the Market Analysis team. My name is Paweł Gorzyński. I'm representing the Investor Relations team. Let me remind you that our broadcast is simultaneously interpreted to English, and let me emphasize that you can ask questions only via a form available on the broadcast website. So I'd like to invite you to ask questions via the form available on the website. And the final piece of information, technically, due to the data protection regulations, we will not be providing your contact details or your details of the persons asking questions. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Let me move on to the presentation for the first 9 months of this year. On the first slide, we are showing to you the key data for the first 9 months of 2020, of course, as compared to last year. What's worth noting is the fact that our EBITDA went up 8%, sales revenue went up by 6%. In terms of operating data, one may say that the entire 9 months in our TAURON Capital Group was marked by the pandemic, was marked by the effects of the pandemic on the economy. The distribution, the volume of electricity distributed fell 5%. Electricity production by hard coal-fired units went down by 22%, but we also had some positive developments, such as an increase of electricity generation from renewable energy sources by more than 40%, and an increase of commercial coal production by more than 20%. On the next slide, you can see the earnings for Q3 alone. Here, the situation is very similar as for the entire 9 months. One should also note here that Q3 is better versus Q2, and as a matter of fact, also versus the entire 9 months of this year. You can see it when you look at the volume of electricity distributed, where the volume dropped 2%. So one may say that in Q3, the volume of electricity distributed has practically rebounded. In Q3, we were dealing with a significant increase of production of coal by 60% and retail and electricity generation from renewables by almost 40%. On the next slide, you can see the most important events, the highlights of 2020. I will not be getting into details of each of them. I'd like to draw attention to such highlights as the commissioning of 910 megawatt power generating unit in Jaworzno, our final coal investment project, also commissioning of Stalowa Wola CCGT unit, obtaining 2 billion PLN to finance the group's operations in 2020. And also, as we informed you when we were acquiring this financing, financing is to be used, is intended for use for our green turn of TAURON strategy implementation. Moving on to the macroeconomic data, as I mentioned, the economic effects of the pandemic had a very major impact on TAURON Group. We can see here in Q2 a significant decline of the GDP growth rate. In Q3, we saw some rebound in terms of industrial production sold. We can see the situation was very similar. Please note a clear increase of sentiment among the business people. In the period under review, the consumption of electricity dropped by 4%. Production fell 6.6%. Imports went up by almost 40%. If you look at the structure of domestic production, what's important is the decline of electricity production from hard coal-fired and lignite-fired units. When you look at the basic financial data, key financial data for the first 9 months of this year, is, of course, the sales revenue. The sales revenue went up to almost 15 billion PLN. It was a consequence primarily of the electricity price, sales price, a larger volume of electricity sold in the on the wholesale market, and higher revenue from the system service. I mean here the intervention, called intervention reserve service. When you compare the net profit in the both periods under review, we can see a clear decline of result in 2020. However, this is the consequence of an event that we informed you about when we presented the H1 results, first half results, which was the write-down of assets carrying value, which was due to reclassifying TAURON Ciepło subsidiary into the discontinued operations, so the assets held for sale, in fact. EBITDA comparable, after excluding one-offs, was practically flat. I'd like to draw your attention to one-off event, which had an important impact upon the improvement of the EBITDA in the period under review, namely the dissolving of the provisions for the equivalent payment for electricity in the total amount for the entire group, 533 million PLN. In Q3 alone, the comparable results were similar, although we can see a significant improvement of EBITDA by 27%. Further on in the presentation, we will present to you, elaborate on the reasons for this improvement. Summing up the results of our individual segments for the first 9 months of this year, one should note that invariably the distribution segment is very important, which in the first 9 months of 2020 contributed more than 70% of our group's EBITDA. And also still significant is the renewable energy segment, which again generated 217 million PLN in EBITDA during that period. In Q3 alone, the situation is quite similar. When you look at EBITDA for the first 9 months of this year, and when you look and try to identify which segments we reported an increase of EBITDA, first of all, you should point out the distribution segment, the mining segment, and the supply segment. Negative impact came from the generation segment, and I will also elaborate on the reasons for this situation. In Q3 alone, positive impact came from the supply, the mining, and the distribution segments, whereas the renewable energy sources segment and generation had a negative impact upon our EBITDA in Q3 alone. Now let's move on to our largest segment, the distribution segment, why it had a positive impact upon our earnings. First of all, one should point out a one-off event that I mentioned before, namely the dissolving of the provision for the equivalent payment for electricity. In the distribution segment, the impact of this positive impact of this event on EBITDA is 425 million PLN. I indicated 537 for the entire capital group. And the second very important factor, namely the price of distribution services sales. In this respect, there are two things that are important. The first one is the fact that the tariff, the distribution tariff in 2019 was approved only starting from April 6. So during the first quarter of 2019, the tariff was lower. Therefore, basically we have a higher rate for distribution services in 2020 as compared to 2019. The second factor is very important as well, namely the structure of the electricity distributed has changed. More of the electricity distributed we sell now in the household segment, while we sell less, we deliver less electricity in the industrial and SME segment. Although in Q3 alone, you can see that especially the SME segment is not reporting such large declines as we saw in Q2 alone. Also, due to the change of the structure, that was also the reason for the increase of the rate for distribution services rate, and that's why we have important impact on the EBITDA. The structure, briefly speaking, the change of structure of electricity distributors had a positive impact on the EBITDA in this period. Looking at Q3 alone, also you can see the impact of this development, this phenomenon. We don't have a tariffs impact, which was approved a bit later in the here the price of the service is the change of the average price, is the change of the structure of the volume of electricity distributed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when you look forward, the future of the distribution segment, the quality component is very important. Let me remind you that the President of the Energy Regulatory Office takes into account the quality parameters that we are presenting to you on the slide, and this quality element is very important for the future tariff. We can see clearly that the quality parameters that the distribution segment that are characteristic for the distribution segment are within the range acceptable to the President of the Energy Regulatory Office. So we don't see any threat for the future tariffs. So we will not have our tariff lowered because we are not within the quality range. Moving on to the next segment is the renewable energy segment. The segment we'll be presenting separately, starting from this year. First of all, you need to pay attention to a one-off event, as we showed the negative impact of RES segment EBITDA in Q3 alone. This is due to the fact that you can see what you can see here. The recognition in 2019, the booking in 2019 of positive result on the opportunistic purchase of the assets. Generally, we speak about the comparison of the price that we paid for the assets acquired and the value of these assets listed on the balance sheet. The total impact of that is 120 million PLN. It's a one-off event that occurred in Q3 alone. Of course, when we compare year over year the renewable segment, we also take that event into account, but it will not be recurring in the subsequent period. So that's why we have this impact of the segment on EBITDA or on the earnings of Q3 alone. Generally, if we disregarded this event, the EBITDA in this segment would have been higher. First of all, due to the higher volume of electricity produced. As you can see at the bottom, what's the electricity production in volume in terawatt hours. In terms of water situation, hydrological situation was difficult in the first quarter. Later, the situation was much improved in a hydrological situation. Wind conditions are good. One may say, as compared to the previous year, for the entire period, it was a good situation, favorable situation. A positive impact we can see in terms of the property rights prices. The prices of property rights in the period under review went up. And as I mentioned, Q3 alone, you can see a very clear impact of this one-off event. So that's why this strong impact upon the group's EBITDA. But this will no longer be a recurring event. Here, the increase of production is smaller. It did occur, but it's smaller than if you compare to the full first 9 months, due to the fact that the wind farms that we acquired last year were acquired beginning of September, so we are including them for the entire Q4 and part of the Q3 in our production. But during the first part of the year, those wind farms, the production from those wind farms did not occur in TAURON Group in 2019. Moving on to the generation segment, here we are dealing with one-off event here that you should note. Namely, we're talking about the swap of CO2 emission allowances purchase contracts, where we are showing 214 million PLN in total. Our approach was different in 2020 with respect to the hedging of CO2 emission allowances rights. Our approach was different in such way that we departed from the direct exchange contracts and we moved to the contracts directly made with the financial institution. But we did it so that we sold the hedging, our hedges for the CO2 emission allowance. At the same time, we hedged ourselves with respect to the CO2 emissions directly with financial institutions. Because of that, due to the price differences, we showing 126 million PLN of loss because of the price differences. But this negative result will be accounted for in 2020, 2021, roughly in such way that half of that will be accounted for in this year and half of that loss will be accounted for in next year. We are showing here then in the first 9 months this 214 million PLN. This negative result will be systematically getting smaller. An important element that had an impact upon the EBITDA in this segment was the margin on electricity. Here we can see clearly that the market does not reflect the increase of the prices of the CO2 emission allowances fully. The increase of CO2 emission allowance prices has an impact upon the electricity prices, but it's not fully reflected in the electricity price. In our case, if we compare the average price for the first 9 months of 2020 and the first 9 months of 2019, basically the average price obtained by this segment is flat, is at the same level. The cost of purchasing the CO2 emission allowances, practically the cost of retiring those CO2 emission allowances per 1 megawatt hour in 2019 was in the region of 60 PLN. In 2020, it's the order of 90 PLN, so a 50% increase. This demonstrates the scale of this development in this segment. This is the main reason for the negative impact of the margin on electricity on this segment. Here, on the other hand, the positive developments include definitely much better production from the Łagisza unit. 450 megawatt unit in Łagisza was much, its availability was much higher this year than last year, so therefore the much larger production, 1.3 terawatt hours more. This had a positive impact. Nevertheless, the increase of the cost of retiring the CO2 emission allowances had a total negative impact. In terms of the biomass-fired units, the situation is better in the period under review, mainly due to the smaller but still a decrease of the prices, biomass prices, and what I mentioned before, a higher price of the certificates of origin of electricity. In Q3 alone, the situation is similar. Here also we're dealing with a very substantial increase of the cost of CO2 emission allowances. In Q3 alone it was 108 PLN per megawatt hour, so we can see clearly that this is a very important cost element. That's such a strong impact of the margin on electricity on the result of the segment. And ladies and gentlemen, now let's move on to the discontinued operations. The discontinued operations is TAURON Ciepło, TAURON Heat subsidiary. It is being presented here in such way due to the fact that at this point in time we are conducting negotiations with Polish oil and gas company, PGNiG company, regarding the sale of this company. We have exclusive negotiations until the end of November, and due to the international accounting standards, we are presenting this subsidiary as a subsidiary held for sale. So this, for TAURON Group, it's called discontinued operations. But of course, these operations are conducted normally, as it is usually done. In the first 9 months of this year, you can see a decline of EBITDA. EBITDA of TAURON Heat subsidiary. This was due first of all to the weather conditions. It's clear that such companies as TAURON Heat, weather is a very important factor. We are dealing, one can say, with a historic lack of winter in 2019-2020 on the turn of the year. That's why the situation this segment is as it is. Here we've seen a slight improvement of EBITDA due to the higher production from biomass, as mentioned before. In Q3 alone, also higher production from biomass-fired units improved the earnings. The result is a bit slightly negative, but one must remember that Q3 for the heat companies is not the best time of year. In the supply segment, first of all, you should pay attention, you should note the repurchasing, buying back of electricity from the 910 megawatt unit in Jaworzno, and to a lesser degree from the Stalowa Wola unit. Here, due to the fact that both these units were not operating for the first 9 months of this year, we were buying back the electricity that we had sold before. The market situation had a positive impact upon the results of those transactions. The total positive impact was more than 300 million PLN. Nevertheless, this is, one may say, something that we consider as something that we will hold up for in the longer term, because that was only due to the good market situation. That's why we got a good result of here. If electricity prices went up, that result would have been much worse on this operation, of this transaction. Of course, therefore, a very positive development is now the commissioning of the 910 megawatt units in Jaworzno and the Stalowa Wola unit. In terms of the property rights in the supply segment, the impact of the increase of the prices is reverse than in case of the previous segments discussed. So the RES, the renewables, the heat, and the generation, due to the increase of certificates of origin of electricity, the EBITDA was lower. And now, ladies and gentlemen, looking at Q3 alone here, as a matter of fact, the most important aspect is this, are the transactions related to the repurchasing of electricity on the market, the total impact being more than 60 million PLN. However, in the supply segment in Q3 alone, one should also note the fact that we received the decision with respect to equalizing the compensations, the final reconciliation of a settlement of compensations related to electricity prices in 2019, and this had a positive impact upon the EBITDA. In this segment, the price of property rights, as I mentioned before, had a negative impact on the earnings in this segment. Ladies and gentlemen, now let's move on to the last segment that we are presenting, mining segment. Here, definitely a very positive impact came from the increase of production, both in the first 9 months of this year as well as in Q3 alone. This had a positive impact upon the earnings. Nevertheless, the increase of production came at such point where, due to the fact, as I mentioned before, due to the pandemic, there was a major drop of demand for this coal. It was partly, of course, related to the lower production of electricity by the hard coal-fired units, but also was related to the warm winter, which also had an impact upon the demand for coal. So the coincidence of those factors led to the situation where a large portion of that larger production went into inventory, went to stock, and placing such production in inventory leads to the not showing the cost of production in the P&L statement, but only in the balance sheet. But due to the relationship between the cost and revenue, we are showing this on this other. Here, this is first of all the impact of increase in the inventory levels. The mining segment is working very hard on improving its efficiency of its operations. One of the elements of that was the obtaining of financing under the anti-crisis shield in the amount of 47 million PLN for the total 9 months. This was related to the reduction of wages, shortening of working time, and we'd like to thank very much the workforce here for their constructive approach to this issue. Let me add that the generation segment also conducted such an operation. Also, with respect to the generation segment, I'd like to thank the workforce for going along with this operation. Thanks to that, the EBITDA was more than 16 million PLN for the TAURON capital group in total, higher. As you can see here, the result is much better. Let me just say that for the entire year, for a full year, we expect a better result in the mining segment. Nevertheless, due to the fact that there are scheduled retoolings of the longwall coal faces, the intensity of those retoolings that are planned, reinforcements that are planned in Q4, which will lead to the reduction of the production output. So one must be aware of the fact that in Q4 alone the result will not be a positive result, but definitely if nothing else happens, but it should be better than in 2019. In Q3 alone, a very important factor that had an impact upon the improvement of this result, here the inventories were not going up so much versus 2019, was the higher sales of coal. This was primarily related to two factors. One factor being, of course, the intense work on selling more large lump coal and medium-sized coal, lump coal, everything that we sell outside of the utilities sector. Maybe in tonnage terms it's not very impressive, but has a very important impact upon the earnings of the segment, and also higher sales related to the commissioning, not yet fully putting into operation, but commissioning of 910 megawatt unit in Jaworzno. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me say a few words about the situation with respect to the debt and financing. The net debt to EBITDA ratio at the end of September is 2.53. It was the ratio level that is safe. The total amount of financing available end of September 30 is 3,500,000,000 PLN. After the end of September, we acquired another billion in additional financing that we informed you about this before. So one may say that in terms of financing, the situation of our group is stable. In the coming year, 2021, we don't have not have to repay large financing. The first big repayment comes in 2022, and on an ongoing basis we'll be working on our structure of our financing so that the situation could continue to be stable and safe. Moving on now, ladies and gentlemen, to the key projects, investment projects. One may say that from this table, 3 projects have been completed, namely the construction of the genetic unit in Jaworzno, Instalowa Wolo, and the implementing the heat production at the 460 megawatt unit at Łagisza power plant. At the very beginning, we showed you a 5% increase of the heat production group-wide, which is a bit contrary to what I said before, that mild winter meant that less heat was needed, but this 5% increase was due to the implementing heat production at the Łagisza power plant. And the 3 projects that are listed here are practically over. Out of those projects that we showed you, only one, the one that is made up of smaller projects, adaptation of TAURON generating units to the BET conclusion. This project will be completed next year, will be finished next year, due to the fact that the new BET conclusions come into force as of middle of August. Ladies and gentlemen, the last slide of our presentation, the structure of our investment, capital expenditures, of our capex. Invariably, the distribution is a major portion of our capex. You can see clearly that it's a very important element. Also generation, but the generation should, in the future period, should have its capex should be lower due to the fact that we have commissioned the units that I already mentioned and pointed out on the previous slide. And now, ladies and gentlemen, that's all from me regarding the presentation. And now I'd like to hand over the floor to you, but more so to Paweł, who is the moderator here. He'll be reading your questions. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for your presentation. A number of questions came in from investors and analysts. The first questions are related to the supply segment, why such a good result in the supply segment? Why isn't the company adjusting the EBITDA, taking into account numerous one-off events in total of 135 million PLN? As I mentioned before, the earnings of the supply segment, very good earnings. The good result of the supply segment is primarily the effect of repurchases of electricity. And basically one may say that this is practically a one-off event, but not quite, because as a matter of fact it's normal operations, but this will not occur anymore next year. The total impact of those repurchases, those buybacks for the entire 9 months is the amount of more than 300 million PLN. Would it be worth to make an adjustment? It's a matter of a presentation. If you would prefer that for us to show it more transparently, we could do that, but each time, of course, we indicate, we note what is the impact of those one-off events on the results. So we are trying to provide you the best information we can possible. Thank you very much. Mr. President mentioned about the impact of buybacks, electricity buybacks on the first 9 months results. One of the analysts asked a question about the impact of the buybacks, electricity buybacks on the earnings in Q3. In Q3 alone, it was more than 60 million PLN. That was the impact. Thank you very much. The next question is related to the coal segment. The company mentioned about setting aside or spinning off the segment, coal segment out of its structure. Can you give more details? When are you planning to complete the works on spinning off the coal mines? According to the agreement concluded in September with the workforce of a Polish mining group, PGG, by December 15th, the agreement with the workforce should be concluded regarding the entire mining sector. Of course, here it means that such an agreement should also include TAURON mining subsidiary. As of today, we don't know any more details. The works are continued on these documents. TAURON mining subsidiary set up 3 teams that are working on the components or concepts that could be taken into account here when negotiating this agreement. It's difficult for me to say anything more about it, but I think soon we'll find out how this will be resolved. Let me put it this way, that definitely TAURON mining, TAURON Wydobycie is a part of the entire mining segment in Poland, and we would really like our subsidiary to be taken into account in those agreements, because any changes regarding other coal mines will have an impact upon TAURON mining subsidiary. Thank you very much. More questions regarding the mining segment. This time the question is about the expected coal production in Q4 this year and the outlook for the entire 2020 and next year 2021 regarding the coal production volume. Well, let me put it this way. We are expecting that full 2020 total production of coal will be in the region of 4.5 million tons. I don't remember the predicted level for Q4 alone. You have to subtract the production in the first 3 quarters, whereas in 2021 we are expecting an increase of extraction output volume to reach 5 million tons. As I said, Q4 will be weak because of significant coinciding of retooling works, reinforcing works on the longwall coal fields, but the outcome of that should be higher production in 2021. Thank you very much. We just received the same questions again, so I will not repeat it. The next question is related to the capacity market. Do you see any reasons for the capacity market to be suspended and then subsequently significantly change next year? Of course, ladies and gentlemen, everyone has in the back of their minds the issue of tempos and the potential risk related to the suspension of the capacity market, which took place a few years back in Great Britain. But our view is as follows. First of all, the capacity market in Poland was designed in such a way in order to take into account whatever happened in Great Britain. So in our opinion, the risk that the situation in Poland will be similar to the British situation where the capital market was suspended for 11 months, in our opinion, this risk is low. We expect that next year the capital market will be operating without any disruptions and the capital contracts will be implemented. And that's how we view it and prepare ourselves for that as a group. Therefore, we are adapting our generation union to the bad conclusions, bad requirements, and we are making sure that the units are dispatchable mainly to a large degree due to the capacity market. Thank you very much. Next questions related to the distribution segment and the weighted average cost of capital, WACC. The regulator changed the way the risk-free rate is calculated for the weighted average cost of capital in the distribution, takes into account the 3-year average instead of 1.5 years average. Thanks to that, the WACC for 2020 for the distribution segment will be higher had it not been for that change. Nevertheless, it doesn't change the fact that it will be still dropping over subsequent years. Is there a chance that the regulator will change other parameters used to calculate the cost of capital for next year or for the subsequent years? For instance, the beta indicator, the way the cost of debt is calculated, the financial leverage level. What level of WACC can we expect next year? Let me start from the end. What level of WACC we expect? We expect that the WACC should be in the range between 0.3 and 0.45%. Let me remind you that apart from what is mentioned in that question, namely extending the observation period, the regulator also has an opportunity here, an option here to approach or view certain parameters differently, the ones that are being calculated when calculating WACC. This is our expectation, 0.3, 0.5. This means for us a situation, in our opinion, a comfortable situation because of the fact that, as indicated in this question, there was a big risk, high risk, that the WACC would be much lower. But as of today, it's difficult to judge, to predetermine what will happen in the subsequent periods with a weighted average cost of capital. Of course, our stipulation is all the time to make certain changes regarding how this WACC is calculated. However, as of today, in our opinion, everyone is focusing on the next year, namely 2021. What will happen in the subsequent years is difficult to predetermine. However, I will be frank here, but if in the subsequent years one would assume a similar methodology, so the 3-year period of observation, so this WACC should continue to fall in the subsequent periods. We will see. I think that here the regulators bow towards the electric utilities, and extending the observation period is a very positive development, and I think in the subsequent periods of these negotiations with regulators or the talks with regulators will have a positive ending. Thank you. Next two questions are regarding to spinning off the conventional assets, generation assets. What's the most probable approach of the government advisor with respect to the scale of span of net debt and provisions assigned to the conventional electric generation? What amounts could it be? Are other options that instead of an income-based, the replacement-based valuation approach will be used by the ministry or the advisor? It's a detailed question. It's very difficult to prejudge what the approach will be used, because it's a part of a bigger puzzle. It's a part of a certain concept, how you could approach the creation of a national security of supply Electricity Supply Agency, NABE in acronym. It's important how the European Commission will approach this issue. I think that to prejudge here, to determine now how this could be resolved, it's premature due to the fact that there are multiple variables that one needs to take into account. The asset valuation, the replacement instead of an income-based valuation method, whether there are reasons to change this approach. Of course, we would prefer, from my point of view, the replacement-based, value-based method, but it seems to me that it would be very difficult to apply due to the fact, to the developments that we can see happening on the market. As you mentioned, the situation, the conventional electricity generation is more difficult due to the price relationships, electricity prices versus the cost of retiring the CO2 emission allowances. That's why I think that it will be unlikely, it's difficult to turn to the replacement value-based method instead of income-based method. Thank you very much. The next question is regarding the negotiations with the Polish oil company with respect to the heat assets. Can the company sell it significantly significantly lower value than the book value? Can we sell it at a value which is significantly lower than the book value? No. The answer is due to the fact that at the end of June 2020 we made a revaluation of the assets value to the theoretically possible to obtain sales price. I'm saying theoretically possible because the negotiations are still underway, and here the final price, the ultimate price, should be agreed by way of a mutual agreement between the two parties. But we can see clearly, based on the offer, on the bid and the negotiations, what price could be put on the table. Therefore, we made a revaluation of the value of those assets. Therefore, the sales at a significantly lower price than its book value is practically out of the question. Let us remember that the sale of a subsidiary of a company is not such a simple thing. The sale price will be subject to certain modifications due to certain changes that may take place in the subsidiary, for instance, the working capital level. But I think these will not be significant changes that may have an impact upon the final price. Should be significantly lower before the book value, beneath the book value. When the negotiations will be completed until the end of November, we have this exclusive negotiations. What will happen later is difficult to determine now. We should be patient here. We have to remember the negotiations are a talk between the two parties, and the result of the negotiations is the agreement reached by the two parties. So we have to wait here for the final outcome of the negotiations. Thank you very much. And the questions regarding the exchange obligation. Can you give a comment on the proposal to limit the exchange obligation for electricity sales? Do you expect such a solution to be implemented? What could be its impact upon TAURON? Well, let me ask Mr. Witold Łebko to answer this question. Ladies and gentlemen, with respect to the exchange obligation, we are observing that this is not a precondition, a prerequisite, necessary precondition for the liquidity of the exchange-based market, because this type of solution is not commonly used on the European markets. And in spite of that, the volumes, turnovers on the exchange markets are at satisfactory levels with respect to the impact on TAURON Group. If, however, the turnover should go down on the exchange, it would be necessary to sign contracts on the market, bilateral contracts on the market, and it seems to us that from the point of view of hedging the group's positions, this solution is neutral, as a matter of fact. We are evaluating in terms of hedging on the exchange market of the group's positions. The liquidity is significant due to the fact that a certain market benchmark should be generated, but it's not a prerequisite that could have any negative impact upon the cost of hedging the group's positions. So, as of today, one should also note that it is a planned solution, and we do not know exactly what will be its final shape. So, in terms of evaluating this mechanism, we should refrain until we see the draft that will be later processed and potentially implemented. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That was the final question that we received. Thank you very much for taking part in our earnings conference call. We'd like to invite you for the next meeting that will take place when we will be reporting the full year 2020 results in the spring next year. In your daily work, please contact our investor relations team. And for now, thank you very much and see you next time. Thank you.